Thank you. Your main concern here is care. I think that we can make common cause because, I hope, we are all interested in the health of populations. The opening lines of my book, The Health Gap, was what good does it do to treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick? We do need to treat people when they get sick, but we need to pay attention to the conditions that made people sick. I'm going to start with a very pressing concern, data that were released in the United Kingdom last week, which followed on from something that my colleagues and I had published a year ago, which is what has happened to the health of the population. Can you put the slide up, please? Can I have this slide? I could start again. We're all interested in the health of populations. And that's my Twitter handle. Had to have that up there. In the United Kingdom, England, as well as in most wealthy countries, life expectancy has been improving. From the end of the Great War, 1921, till 2010, 11, 90 years, life expectancy increased about 1 year every 4 years. Dramatic. And we're used to things getting better all the time. That's what we expect. Life expectancy increases about 1 year every 4 years. And in 2010, that ground to a halt. It stopped. And as you can see, for men and for women, it was more or less flat from 2011 to 2015. I wrote to our health minister and said, this is a health crisis. You should take this as seriously as you would a winter bed shortage. He did. He ignored them both, but that isn't quite what I had in mind. More recent data showed that life expectancy had more or less ground to a halt in England, was declining for men in Northern Ireland, declining for men and women in Scotland, declining for men and women in Wales. This is terrible. We expect health to get better all the time, and it stopped. In fact, it's getting worse. Last week, the Office for National Statistics looked at inequalities and the change to life expectancy in days by level of deprivation of the area. And you can see that, so 10 is the most affluent, the richest decile, 1 is the poorest, and you can see the richer the area, the bigger the increase. The poorer the area, in fact for women, is actually a decrease. Women in the poorer areas of England are getting sicker. And it's not that I think length of life is the sole measure of population health, but it's a good indicator. And if you accept the proposition that the health of a population tells us something fundamental about how well that society is meeting the needs of its members, something is going wrong. And I looked across the Atlantic and said, is this our future? I've made this slide, life expectancy declining 2 years in a row. In November, the Centers for Disease Control reported that life expectancy in the US had declined 3 years in a row. Unprecedented. You've got to look at the crisis in Central and Eastern Europe, the collapse of communism in the former Soviet Union, to see something like this. This is unprecedented. This is an absolute crisis. And that orange nightmare in the White House neither knows nor cares. He talks about the US doing better than ever before in its whole history, and they're killing themselves. Look at this. Unintentional injuries, which includes accidental drug overdose. So dispirited are people by the success of the United States that 63,600 people died from accidental drug overdose in 2016. In 2017, that had already gone up to 70,000 people. Add to that 32,000 deaths from firearms. That's 100,000 deaths, really, that should not occur. Now, in Europe, we don't have the same opioid crisis that they do in the US. And it's not just overprescribing by doctors. It's not only the unconscionable behavior of the marketers of OxyContin. These are deaths of despair. And what's been happening to inequalities in the US? One of my mantras is that health inequalities are not confined to poor health for the poor, but they follow the social gradient. This is life expectancy at age 50 by year of birth, by deciles of income. So people who are born in 1920 will be 50 in 1970. The lowest decile, it's a gradient. The more income you have, the longer you live. Now look what, this is men, by the way. Now look what happened over the next 30 years. For the poorest 10%, life expectancy barely increased at all. The next 10%, it increased somewhat more. So the gradient got steeper. The inequalities got bigger. That's men. You feeling strong? Robust? Ready for the next slide? That's women. Oh my God. Life expectancy went down for the poorest 10%. It went down for the second poorest 10%. It went down for the third decile. For the bottom 30% in income terms of the population, life expectancy declined. The inequalities got dramatically bigger, the gradient got steeper, and health got worse for the bottom 30%. Is this our future? And this is not simply a healthcare issue. As I showed you with the deaths of despair, accidental poisonings, suicide, alcohol, and we know that's been the big increase. What can we do about this? I chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. We called our report, Closing the Gap in a Generation, and we said on the cover, social injustice is killing on a grand scale. Slightly unusual for a WHO report. And in the wake of the Global Commission, I was asked by the British government, how could we apply the findings and recommendations of your Global Commission to one country, England? I produced the so-called Marmot review, Fair Society, Healthy Lives. We then did a European review, something's happened to the cover, of social determinants and the health divide. And these were the recommendations of my English review. And I venture to suggest that they are widely applicable, not just to England. 6 domains of recommendations: give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. Number 4, having enough money to live on, being able to pay the rent, buy food for your children. Number 5, healthy and sustainable places to live and work. And number 6, taking a social determinants approach to prevention. And I have views, strong views, about how the healthcare system can engage with these wider social determinants of health. And the PAHO Commission that you heard about The report's due to be launched about the middle of this year. The executive summary we presented to the governing bodies of the Pan American Health Organization last September, and we called it Just Societies, Health Equity, and Dignified Lives. We want to take the necessary actions to make it possible for everyone to have a dignified life. And if we do that, health will improve and health equity will improve. And it's not only about money. You've probably seen a version of the Preston curve before, but these are from our American countries. On the x-axis, we've got gross domestic product per person, adjusting for purchasing power. And on the y-axis, life expectancy. And what you can see, at low levels of national income, a small increase in national income is associated with a big increase in life expectancy. For a country, if you've got no money, if you're Haiti or Bolivia, then having some money is quite helpful. And it's true if you're a household. If you've got no money, having a bit more money is quite helpful. That's what the evidence shows. But when you get up to Costa Rica at about $19,000 per person at purchasing power parities, adjusting for purchasing power, Cuba and Chile, and you go all the way out to the United States at 62,000, well, 59,000 there, it's now 62,000. No change. In fact, life expectancy in Costa Rica is longer than in the United States. The route to getting healthier is not getting richer once you're above a certain level. And that's quite interesting because I showed you deciles of income in the US, and I said the richer you are, the longer you live. It's not just money. It's social conditions that within a country are highly correlated with household income, but between countries are not highly correlated with national income. In Costa Rica, in Cuba, in Chile, they can live longer than in the United States at lower levels of income. And you can see this. This is mortality in the US and Costa Rica. The red is Costa Rica, smoothed out, the US. So at high levels of socioeconomic position, the US has lower mortality than Costa Rica. Surprise, surprise. At the upper end of the income distribution, the socioeconomic distribution in the US, they live longer than at the upper end in Costa Rica. But at the lower end, if you're going to be poor, you're better off to be poor in Costa Rica from the point of view of your health than poor in the United States, even though the poor in the US are much richer than the poor in Costa Rica in money terms. It's the social conditions that are vital. So this is the conceptual framework for our PAHO Commission. Don't write it down because I'm going to go through them, but we deal with the structural drivers, the conditions of daily life, and they relate to health equity and a dignified life. We look at intersectionality, social and economic inequities, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability, and migration, and taking action is a matter of governance and human rights. So, structural drivers. We deal with equity in political, social, cultural, and economic structures. One example is the ratio of income in the top and bottom quintiles. So there's Canada. The top quintile of income has about 6 times the income of the bottom quintile. In Nordic countries, it's about 4 times. We think of the US as being very unequal, and indeed, it's much more unequal than most European countries and than Canada, 10 times. But look at these Latin American countries, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. much bigger inequalities. The standard of living for the top quintile in Brazil or Colombia is not so different from the standard of living in the top quintile in Canada or the United States. In fact, the top quintile in Colombia probably have maids and chauffeurs and private security and all of those things to protect themselves from the ghastly conditions of the bottom quintile. But down the bottom, it's a good deal worse. Structural drivers, the natural environment, climate change, and relationship to land, which of course is crucial for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, relationship to land. I don't have only bad news, I have good news. Look at this. Costa Rica, percentage of renewable energy in 2016, almost all of Costa Rica's energy was renewable energy. Hey, could make a difference to climate change. You've got to have the will to do it, but they're doing it. Panama, not bad. Central America as a whole, more than 60% of energy is renewable energy. And the health equity impacts of ongoing colonialism, structural racism. I don't need to tell people in the Basque Country what it means to be disempowered politically. Conditions of daily life. Equity from the start. Let me come back to Europe. I mean, we have recommendations for the US and the Americas. We've been monitoring in England health equity and inequities in the social determinants of health through the life course. So, for example, we've been looking at early childhood. If you would, focus on the blue dots. The blue dots are the average in England, and each dot represents the percent of children age 5 that have a good level of development for each local authority in the country. And here you've got the most deprived and there the least deprived. And what you see is a gradient. The more affluent the area, the higher the proportion of children age 5 with a good level of development. Cognitive, linguistic, social, emotional, and behavioral development. One strategy to reduce inequalities in early childhood is to reduce deprivation. Move these local authorities towards the middle, and the proportion of children age 5 with a good level of development will go up. And I start with early child development because we've got a life course. Better early child development, children perform better in school when they graduate. They're likely to go on to further education, get a better job, higher income, better living conditions, and better health. And it starts in early childhood. But notice, there's scatter around the line. For a given level of deprivation, some local areas are doing better than others. A higher proportion of children age 5 with a good level of development. Aha, that's a second strategy. Break the link between deprivation and poor early child development. Now you're allowed to look at the red dots. The red dots are children eligible for free school meals. It's a means-tested benefit, so these are the poorer children. The graph goes the other way. The poorer children are doing better in poor areas than in rich areas. Hey, that's really interesting. Not what I predicted, really interesting. So I went to a poor area in East London, Hackney. Look first at England. 60% of children age 5 have a good level of development on average. And for children eligible for free school meals, it's just under 45%. The gap is just under 16%. Now, Hackney, a poor area of East London, the poor kids are doing as well as the national average. Coming from a poor background in Hackney doesn't blight you to anything like the same extent in the rest of England. And in fact, the gap between the poor kids and the average in Hackney is only 4%. That's terrific. I said to them in Hackney, what do you do? And the director of education said, we tell ourselves every day, poverty is not destiny. That's what we do when we get up in the morning. We try and reduce the problems associated with a deprived background. And then, if you know anything about the geography of the UK, you might wonder why beautiful Georgian Bath set in rolling green hills, lovely place. And look at the gap. The poor kids do really badly. Perhaps because there aren't many of them in Bath, so they neglect them. If you neglect the poor kids in Hackney, what are you doing? There's so many of them. That's your job. This is terrific. We can break the link between deprivation and poor outcomes really quickly. I said reduce poverty. This is a comparison for rich countries of children in poverty, where poverty is a relative measure defined as less than 60% median income. Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Korea, poverty levels around 9, 10, 11%. I was in Sweden last week and I pointed out that Sweden used to be here with Denmark, Iceland, Norway and Finland, but it's up a bit higher, it's 15%. The UK, just below 20%. The United States, just under 30%, where Spain is, just below Mexico. The Minister of Finance has a bigger impact on health equity than the Minister of Health. He can pull the levers that would reduce child poverty. In a rich country like the United States, and in a less rich country like Spain, the Minister of Finance chooses not to do that. In the Nordic countries, they're intolerant of child poverty, so they reduce it. And this has a dramatic impact on health equity through the life course. So I've been talking implicitly about the good side of early child development, cognitive, linguistic, social, emotional, behavioral development. The bad side is adverse child experiences. And adverse child experiences follow the social gradient. The lower the income, the higher the deprivation, the more likely it is that parents have been incarcerated. Drug abuse, sexual abuse, alcohol abuse, domestic violence, physical abuse, mental illness, verbal abuse, and parental separation. All of these adverse child experiences are more common as you go down the socioeconomic gradient. And they damage children through the life course. When we look at people who had suffered from 4 or more adverse child experiences, it increases the likelihood of early sex by 1/3, unintended teen pregnancy by 38%, smoking by 1/6, binge drinking, cannabis use. Look at this. Violence perpetration. Half the perpetrators of domestic violence had suffered from 4 or more adverse child experiences. If you want to reduce domestic violence, reduce adverse child experiences. And even more chilling, half the victims of domestic violence had suffered 4 or more adverse child experiences. Decent work. Whoops. I talked about intersectionality. This is young people not in education or employed in the labor market by African descent identity. Look in Colombia, for example, non-Afro-descendant men, Afro-descendant men. So if you're of African descent, you're more likely to be not in employment or education. And if you're a woman, you're more likely than a man not to be in education or employment. And if you're an Afro-descendant woman, you're more likely than a non-Afro-descendant woman. So this intersectionality of gender and ethnic background is key. Dignified life at older ages, income and social protection. Come back to the UK. In London, 17% of children grow up in a household at less than 60% median income. After housing costs, 37%. Housing is a poverty issue. The cost of housing causes poverty, and poor people can't afford decent housing. It is a poverty issue. And we've had a massive sell-off of social housing. The proportion of people in London in social housing went down from 38% to 23%. Absolutely dramatic. And the private rentals went up, and people can't afford private rentals. We like to think that work is a way out of poverty. This is working age poverty composition, workers and non-workers from the 1996 to 2016. And that color, whatever that is workless families. And all the rest have at least one family member in work. The majority of people in poverty have at least one family member in work. They're not in poverty because they can't be bothered working. They're not in poverty because they're feckless or irresponsible. They're in poverty because they're lowly paid. That took a lot of detailed analysis to figure that one out. And look at this, we tell people to eat healthily. If people in England followed the healthy eating advice, for people in the bottom decile of household income, they would spend 74% of their household income on food. And we say that poor people have only got themselves to blame because they don't follow the advice. We tell them to eat fruit and vegetables and do all that good stuff. If they followed the advice, they'd spend 74% of household income on food. Who's going to pay the rent? And if they pay the rent, they'll have to sit there in the cold because they can't afford to heat the house. They can heat or eat, but they can't do both. Housing is a food issue. It's a poverty issue and it's a food issue. I can't resist. Tax havens increase inequality. 50% of the wealth in tax havens belongs to the top 0.01% of people in advanced economies. I just showed you figures for childhood poverty in London. London has more billionaires than any other city on the planet. And we have children growing up in inadequate housing, homeless. That wealth squirreled away in tax havens is equivalent to 5% of GDP globally. It's tax avoidance on a massive scale by individuals, and then added to that is avoidance of tax by multinationals. 600 billion euros a year shifted to the world's tax havens. 350 billion euros into European tax havens, mainly profit from EU countries. Multinationals are operating in our countries and they're not paying tax. It deprives the EU of a fifth of... I'm still concerned about the EU, despite, the garbage going on in my country at the moment. I'm such a naive optimist. I keep thinking someone's going to stop this nightmare. I'm one of the 6 million people who signed a petition to revoke Article 50. 6 million people signed a petition to revoke Article 50. We are brothers and sisters. We're all part of some global community. You know, we belong to each other. Whether we're in Latin America or in Europe, I mean, it's... Reducing violence, environment and housing conditions, health systems, governance, human rights. We said a lot. I'm flipping over these just because he'll take my microphone away if I give you details on all of them. But let me just mention one human rights issue. 1 in 3 women globally, 1 in 3 women globally will experience physical and or sexual violence by a partner or sexual violence by a non-partner. Is there a more fundamental abrogation of human rights than that? But we're making progress. In the wake of our PAHO Commission, we will have a health equity network in the Americas. The Swedish city of Malmö took my WHO Commission report and set up a commission for a socially sustainable Malmö. And now the Swedish cities of Linköping and Norrköping, of Göteborg, of Östersund, other areas of Sweden have taken this on. In England, Coventry is a Marmot city. Wow, we just signed a contract with Manchester. We hope Manchester will become a Marmot region, taking my 6 domains of recommendations and say we want to create a healthier Coventry. And I found this, quote, "A well-being approach can be described as enabling people to have the capabilities they need to live lives of purpose, balance, and meaning for them." Who could have been the source for that quote? Amartya Sen? Yeah, could be. But where I found it was the New Zealand Treasury. This is the basic document for that wonderful person, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Well, she just doesn't have emotional intelligence. This is the strategy for her government. Wow, you can see why I describe my optimism as evidence-based. My 2 messages in a world of post-fact politics is evidence-based policy presented in a spirit of social justice. Remember, we said on the cover of the WHO Commission report, social injustice is killing on a grand scale. And now I'll do the unpardonable, quote myself, but the end of our PAHO Commission report, we said at the heart of the Commission's purpose is ensuring the right of all people in the Americas to lead lives of dignity and enjoy the highest attainable standard of health. We call on all governments to act. Thank you.
I'll take a couple of questions. Sure. Okay, I'm looking at my fellow chair. I think we might have an opportunity unparalleled opportunity to ask a couple of questions. So put your hands up. I think we've got roving mics can come running to you. You're going to have to put them up very high because it's quite difficult to see. Oh, come on, there must be one. Yes, the gentleman at the back there from Canada, I believe. A long way away. Just behind you.
Is this on? Is this working?
Can't hear you.
Check. Hello. Thank you. I'm Jay Shaw. I'm from Toronto. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I wonder if you could comment on the role of cities in all of this. policy is obviously a very important part of what you're suggesting, so what's the role of cities?
I can express the role of cities in a negative way and a positive way. In the United States, for example, where the national government has not been the least bit interested, and that's not just Trump. I mean, President Obama, they were doing nothing nationally on this. So in a negative way, the role of cities is that cities in the United States were really interested. And similarly in the UK, when I produced my 2010 report, the Conservative-led coalition government issued a white paper welcoming my report, but then they pursued policies of austerity that made everything tougher. But the cities got interested. So the negative side is, well, if national governments won't do anything, cities can. The positive side, if cities are where we live and work, that's what happens. It's really important to people. It's the housing, transport, social environment, employment opportunities, cleaning up the air, providing clean water and the like. So cities are really important places. It is where we live and work, where we are born, grow, live, work and age. So cities are really important, and they've been really encouraging. I think the best take-up of the WHO Commission's report and my subsequent reviews have been from cities. And take Toronto, St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. I went there. The Accident and Emergency Department is talking about working with the local community to improve health for the, you're probably part of it, to improve health for their local area. So you've got a tertiary care institution, and your former Minister of Health was part of that. I think she resigned for other reasons. But your former Minister of Health was part of that. So here's a tertiary care institution saying, we have a responsibility to improve the health of our local population. So cities are a key site of action.
Do I see another hand for another question?
Okay, thank you very much. Taking on from the point about inequalities in cities, what about the converse in inequalities in rural areas? It's almost like hidden inequalities.
Yeah, I mean, the two kinds of inequalities in rural areas, the big one in a way is between the rural areas and the urban areas. And then, of course, the inequalities within rural areas. But when we look globally, you can't look at, so for example, you go to Nairobi, you go to Kibera, this huge urban slum with 600,000 people. That slum exists because the population in the rural area grew faster than the income. There was not enough income being generated in the rural area for people to live. So they flock to the cities and then live in substandard human conditions in the cities. So that inequality between rural areas and urban areas is actually causing problems both in the rural areas and in the urban areas. And indeed, the Sustainable Development Goals suggest we really need to think very hard about improving conditions in rural areas as well as in urban areas.
Okay, we'll take two more questions. The gentleman here, and then the lady waving her hand at the back, at the side, at the back there, right at the top. But I think it's John, is it?
Yes, it is. Yes, John Eastwood from Aotearoa, New Zealand, currently in Sydney. I've been chairing Child, Youth and Family Special Interest Group in the social health and social care workshops the last 2 days. And participants have been working through a lot of your work, so thank you very much for your presentation today. One matter that was brought from the floor in those workshops was the mass migration that is currently occurring globally with displacement of people from those because of violence, poverty, lack of water, and I'm thinking we should start to perhaps add that to our list. Could you comment, please?
Yeah, you probably know the figures better than I do, but something like 65 million migrants, and most of it is forced migration in the world, most of it forced migration. And so particularly in Europe, one way of thinking about it is, oh my God, what are we going to do? We've got this great flood of migration happening. But the other, as you're talking about, is trying to deal with the conditions that lead people to flee because they have no alternative. And the situation of migrants is really rather different than going to a land of opportunity, because you need to look at the conditions that were affecting the migrants in their old country, the process of migration coming across from North Africa to Lampedusa in Sicily is extremely hazardous. It's more dangerous than walking the streets of Caracas, where the murder capital of the world. So the process of migration, and then what happens to you when you arrive in the new country? You may be a Syrian doctor who's cleaning the streets. So we need to, these are huge issues that we haven't figured out how to deal with, but we need to, both looking at what happened in the old country that's driving the migration. I mean, you know, look at Yemen. I mean, absolute disaster. Western countries have been supporting Saudi Arabia to devastate the population of Yemen. And then we say, oh, people want to leave, as they do from Syria, which is being supported by Russia, by the West, this ghastly situation. So we need, with care and sympathy, to deal with the issue of migrants when they've arrived, but we also, as you imply, need to deal with the fundamental drivers of migration.
Okay. I'm so sorry, my chair has asked me to conclude, but please come and ask your question to Michael afterwards. Come down, we'll make sure we do that. So thank you very much for your questions. And a round of applause again for Samantha, please, for the excellent presentation.